G'day everybody, and welcome to the 6th COVID-19 Robots and Us weekly discussion with experts. We're looking at the nature of risks and regulations during this liminal time when it's on one hand essential to relax some regulations in order to respond rapidly to the pandemic. And yet on the other hand, we need to stop and think about what unwelcome side effects could be introduced and if the immediate needs justify the overall impact. We're going to be starting by getting some insights into Australian robotics and the COVID response, courtesy of Keay from CSIRO's Data 61 CyberPhysical Systems Group. And to translate that into American, Sue is the equivalent of the head of robotics research at the NSF. She's been the driving force behind Australia's National Robotics Roadmap and the new Australian Robotics Association. She's also been involved in the DARPA SubT challenge, so I think we'll be seeing a little bit about that. And when I get my notes back, yes, here we go. Hopefully we'll be hearing a little bit more about what's happening locally from Thomas Lowe, the Director of Robotics at SRI International. And these tangible use cases will serve us as straw figures for the follow-up discussion with legal and ethical experts. Michael Froomkin, Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Miami and founder of the We Robot Conference on Policy and Law Relating to Robots, which is a great conference, by the way. We'll also hear from Chelsey Colbert, Policy Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum, Brian Calo, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Washington, and returning to us, we'll hear from Robin Murphy, Raytheon Professor at Texas A&M and Rescue Robotics Expert, and of course, Ken Goldberg, Distinguished Chair in Engineering at UC Berkeley and Director of the CITRIS People and Robots Initiative, where I'm a visiting scholar, as it happens. And we're going to be asking, what are the social, legal, and policy implications of the rollout of robots in COVID response? And before we kick off, I'd like to thank the crew, Bo Amber from Kickstarter, who's manning the Zoom, and Erin Pan, our Stanford MBA, who's looking for autonomous vehicle opportunities, who's going to be helping me collect questions from the chat and share links that come up in this. So final housekeeping, if you're not a speaker, please keep your video off and your mic on mute. If you have a question for our experts, please put it into the chat. We'll be monitoring it and doing Q&A after our introductions. So without further ado, over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Andra. So I will try and share my screen and hope that everyone will be able to see the contents. Okay. Apologies.
It's the magic of complex technology. I
yes,
figure we know we're ready for AI when we can fix AV.
Exactly. All right. So I'm sorry, I'll just take another second. But as Andra mentioned, my title is as Research Director for CyberPhysical Systems for CSIRO's Data 61, and the CSIRO is Australia's national science agency. So I'll just give you a very brief background on that. And to start off with, actually show you a little bit of what we've been doing in, I guess, what you would call rescue robotics in terms of what we do. Have been doing as part of a DARPA challenge that we've been competing in the States. We're the only team outside of the US to be funded by DARPA to be part of this. But just to give you a little bit of background, sorry, it took a little while to get that up on the screen. So in terms of cyber-physical systems and the scale of what we do, you know, we have more than 200 researchers really focused on embedded artificial intelligence. About half of those are focused on robotics and autonomous systems, but the others are all in related areas that, you know, can be put towards the production of things like rescue robotics. Some of the areas that we focus on in robotics do lend themselves to the Australian sort of conditions where we have to be able to produce robust platforms that have to operate in difficult environments and be very dependable because we can't necessarily send people out to fix them. And for this reason, we were selected to be part of the current DARPA Subterranean Challenge. We've got a couple of robotic platform technologies that we rely on. One of the things that we, I guess, have a good reputation mentioned for is around our accurate navigation systems. And I guess in Australia, we've had to get used to developing systems that have to operate with no or low power requirements, that can operate in areas where there's limited or no communication, particularly underground or underwater, and generally just operate in extreme environments that the Australian climate often makes happen. So in terms of our role in the DARPA Subterranean Challenge, as with all teams, we had to go in with a range of different robots. They had to be able to take their own communications in underground, and the scenario is like a rescue scenario where you have to send your team of robots in. You have 1 hour to identify certain artifacts that DARPA puts in place underground, and you have to be able to give that information from the robots up to an operator on the surface. And you can imagine that would be very useful in a scenario like a mine collapse or something happening in a subway system where you want to send your robots underground and find out what's going on and get situational awareness before you determine whether it's safe for humans to actually enter that environment. And unfortunately, you know, it's fair to say that up to date, robots haven't really been up to the challenge. So that's the reason DARPA creates these events, to try and push things forward. So here's our team. These were the robots that we sent to Washington State just recently to compete at an abandoned nuclear facility where they had the most recent challenge in February. And I guess the aim was that we send these platforms in with drones on the back, and that they had to be able to self-launch and navigate their way around and find the artifacts that DARPA had put in there. Oh, sorry, was just going to quickly show you how the team operated. So this is one of our Titan platforms. We were very disappointed during the recent Australian bushfires that, again, our robotics technology hasn't really reached the point where we're able to deploy some of these systems to be of help to our frontline workers. You know, we're now following that up with looking at how we can use heat-resistant skins to make sure that we can send robots like this one, which is actually also a firefighting robot, but it has the same vulnerabilities that humans have. We can't put it in areas where there's very high temperatures or it ceases to perform. But this is just our team in action underground at this abandoned nuclear facility, finding its way around. We came fourth in this overall challenge, but we did win the award for having the most accurate location system in determining where the artifacts were as part of the challenge. And this is just to give you a fly through of the sort of information that we're gathering as we're underground and feeding that back up to the surface, and obviously using computer vision and other techniques to be able to identify where the artifacts are. So as I said, it's actually kind of frustrating that we're starting to get to this point of being able to do useful things with robots, particularly in these rescue response scenarios. But we're not quite there, and certainly during the Australian bushfires, we really weren't able to deploy a lot of robots. So a lot of the COVID response in Australia, I suppose, has been similar to what I've seen from Andra's webinars of what's going on in the States. We were very fortunate that our health system was very quick to identify and approve different 3D printing designs that we were able to just push our printers through to be able to meet demand. And so we've been involved with, I guess, a community initiative with our local health service to be 3D printing these, I guess they're face shield holders, are the components that they lack. So they have plenty of the perspex that goes around the face, but really didn't have any of the other material required to make those face shields. I guess I'd say that there's been a lot of activity also around production of ventilators, but Australia has been in the extremely fortunate position where we've not needed to use that. So the main shortages that we have are around PPE for our medical staff, and due to the low community transmission rates in Australia, we're not seeing a need for the general community to be also needing personal protective equipment. So obviously we've had our 3D printers going non-stop, helping to produce a lot of the material that our healthcare workers have required. and yeah, just producing these en masse and continuing to do so, and then looking at refining the design. So looking at using some of our multi-material printers to manufacture flexible face masks for some of our medical professionals. One of the issues that we have with that, which I'm sure is the same in the States, is with our supply chain. So actually there is a shortage of the raw materials that we need to be able to make that those flexible face masks. China is ramping up production again, so we might be able to get those reasonably soon. But as I've mentioned, fortunately, Australia's health system is not under extreme strain at the moment, and hopefully that will continue. Another project that we're considering, and I noticed IEE Spectrum just put out an article on this today or yesterday, of a group called Akara that in Ireland have produced using turtle bots to use for UV disinfection. And that's very similar to something that we're exploring with one of our local companies, Lamps and Concepts, on looking on how we can do the same thing, except we're not using the turtle bot as a platform. We're using a modular robotic system that we've developed in-house that we call AnyWheel. And this is just an example of how AnyWheel operates. It really doesn't matter what you put on the wheel is a robot itself. And I like to think of this as the first step towards the roboticization, if that's a word, of commodity products. So essentially being able to turn any product into a robot simply by adding something like these modular robotic wheels. So really that's it, Andra, in terms of where we're at. It's possible that there are other uses of robots happening in Australia. These are just the ones that, you know, we're more intimately familiar with. And we'd love to be able to do more. In some cases, this is highlighting a need for things like UV disinfectant robots that really didn't exist before. To buy UV disinfectant robots in the past, they've been quite expensive units that you know, the use case for hospitals in Australia really wasn't there. Whereas now when people do face a significant risk of being able to catch COVID-19 from being cleaners in hospitals, the use case makes a lot more sense now for deploying things like UV disinfectant robots. And so that's something that we're actively exploring.
I'm looking forward to comparing notes with you on that as well, because I've got, I'm leading a small project with one of the volunteer groups to develop disinfecting robots ourselves. And I know there's a startup who I'm going to get on here shortly to talk about what they're doing with the Ubiquity mobile robot base. But you may have heard on other webinars me introducing Gillian Ogle from Remo TV. It's a teleoperation platform. So we're not looking at developing an autonomous base, we're looking at converting things like Barbie electric vehicles to carry a lighting tower, and it's completely able to be teleoperated at that point. So it's going to allow us perhaps to insert this technology at a much, much lower price point than an autonomous system does. In fact, this is something that Ken and I have been talking about. We're seeing the need for teleoperation and telemedicine, perhaps much more so than autonomous solutions, because we're just simply not there yet. And in fact, Missy Cummings had some great words about that 2 weeks ago around the difficulty in creating reasoning systems at the level that we need to deal with the, you know, the edge cases, or probably 20% of real life as that happens. So
yes. I 100% agree. I mean, I think the advantage of an autonomous system is simply that you can move the disinfectant unit to make sure that you get all areas, and you can just do that with teleoperation. So why wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Now, that was really great. We don't have Tom here yet, so I don't think that we've got some footage from SRI International. So what I would like to do right now is ask, go to our speakers. And Michael, I would like to call on you first. Michael Froomkin, Distinguished Professor of Law at University of Miami and founder of We Robot Conference. What is your response to the current rollout of robots, and have things significantly changed just in the last 3 months? Or are we just amplifying the problems that already existed?
Well, there's been one area where there's dramatic change, and that's the plethora of apps for tracking contacts, which I think of as robotic in a sense, those on your phone. Otherwise, at least for my bunker here in Miami, what I'm really just seeing is an acceleration, right? So people all of a sudden are much more excited about delivery robots, or they're much more excited about drone delivery, or they're excited about mechanizing various aspects of production, so people won't have to stand too close to each other on the assembly line. And those are changes in speed rather than changes in concept. But the one area that's really new in concept is this idea of putting a pocket Stasi on everybody's phone. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. But that is quite worrying because it's being done so fast we're not thinking it through. Although it's quite encouraging to see in Germany that they didn't go with the quick option and tried to go with the thoughtful option this week. So I can say more about that. I don't know if that fits the idea of the room. It certainly is very different from sterilizing a room, which is obviously a critical idea, but it's not a new idea, right? I mean, when I was in hospital 7 months ago, there was a big black object sitting outside in the hallways that called itself a robot and was, I think, teleoperated. And they went in and sterilized the rooms, between patients. So, again, that that isn't new. I mean, a couple weeks ago, you had a chap on who's got this machine that's going to make drinks in malls robotically, right? I mean, and the idea of robotic food service generally, because people are afraid of COVID, is not a new idea, but it's being accelerated. Now, for most of these things, right, the legal issues, to the extent they're physical, aren't really exciting to law professors because they're either solve problems or almost solve problems, right? If a robot rolls over your foot, we kind of know how to deal with that. I mean, there are some issues at the margin as to when a robot's a product and when it's a service, and that affects how you sue, what you have to prove, and so on. But in either case, that's just a matter of slotting it into a known category. The very tough issues, which Ryan is actually a leader in, are issues about data. Right? There are issues about where the data come from that's used to run the AI that runs the robot. And I think this is where Ryan particularly is my teacher. There are issues about what happens to the things the robot learns. And does the fact that we're coexisting with the robot mean that we react differently? And maybe the robot suckers us into exposing more about ourselves than we would if it was a person. So really you should be calling on Ryan, who, by the way, is also a co-founder of WeRobot. Because when it comes to these issues of robot data collection, more than half what I know I learned from him.
Those are excellent points. And I see this always as a continuum. In many ways, early robots that are called robots are very dumb compared to a lot of the technology around us that we call things like blenders and other things, or just cars. All cars are robots these days. But this segues into the privacy on phones discussion because robots are mobile sensor platforms. And you cannot really divorce them from being a sensor platform and have them continue to function. So there isn't really, it's implausible, if not downright impossible, to say here is a perfectly non-intrusive robot. The active navigation, the ability to be safe around people requires sensors. It's collecting data that is in many ways going to intrude on us if it's poorly used. And we haven't developed an ability yet that I'm aware of to create good platforms to anonymize data. It's totally coming out as each case is a first case at the moment. And as we rush into these situations, I do think that we are opening the door for a very large problem that people like yourself and Ryan and everybody involved in data privacy have been shadowing. And so really robots are just the embodiment of the problems that have already been predicted. Ryan, would you like to add something to that? And then Chelsey, I'd like to call on you.
Sure. I mean, so I learned way more than half that I know from Michael, so I'm not sure how the math adds up. There's a lot of learning that happened there that gets lost. I mean, a couple things. This is a pretty, just looking through the discussion, looking through the participant list, this is a very sophisticated group. And so I kind of want to flag something up from the outset that I do think of as being distinct and different that with respect to robotics and the regulatory regime that they're likely to occasion, if I may. And that is that there is already a tendency when it comes to robotics that whoever is ready first with their version of some commercial application, whether it is you know, a guard robot or a delivery robot, whether flying or on the ground, whoever's first, whoever comes up with this stuff and gets organized, they go to the lawmaker and they describe exactly what they do. And they say, this is the future. And then the lawmaker actually passes a law that just tracks precisely what they're doing. You know what I mean? And so, for example, the delivery services, the state laws, and there's a few of them now, say like extremely specific things about how like it's got to have 4 wheels, or it's got to be 58 pounds. It's got, because Starship told them that that's what they do. You know what I mean? Rather than asking themselves, gosh, here's an interesting new set of affordances. Here's something that a robot can do. How can we think about the right policy infrastructure to capture the advantages? And I am very worried that already existing trend, which is pretty robot unique, is going to be accelerated beyond recognition when people start rolling out COVID-19 robots. They're just going to say, here's what I'm doing. And the next thing you know, that thing's going to be lawful, even though it might not be the sensible thing to do. I can see Robin. I'd love to hear from, I mean, I don't want to skip Chelsey because she's brilliant, but I see Robin wants to jump in here because this is the problem I really worry about right now.
Please jump in, Robin, and we'll come to Chelsey straight after, but you really are at the front line in every sense of the word. So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to distract. I just sort of, no, we're seeing it right now with UAVs. I mean, we've got some groups that are gloating, saying, hey, look, now we've got this, we're forcing the FAA to give us this rapid beyond visual line of sight approval and this, and now they won't be able to take it back after we're done. And the use cases that they've been pitching for justification, you know, I'm running this past emergency managers and they're going, we don't need this. Why is the FAA caving to them? Well, because the emergency, because it's a disaster. So we see this all the time. So anyway, back to y'all. Sorry.
That's a great point, and we're going to come back to that. Thank you, Robin. Chelsey, I'd love to hear what you have to say. What have you seen happening? Is it a problem?
Yeah, these are really great points. I agree with Michael, Robin, and Ryan, that as Michael said, like, these robots aren't new, the concepts are there, but we are seeing the pressure, that the use cases are there. So a lot of the companies have the technology, slowly rolling it out, regulations maybe hindering it, slowing it down a little bit, which staying neutral on that for now, but that is a fact. But then the demand is so much more now. So it is possible that there could be corners cut, regulations made just to get something to pass so it's legal to be on the street. But definitely I'm tracking things in the mobility sector when it comes to delivery robots on the sidewalks, delivery drones, cleaning robots, even care robots. All of these are ripe use cases for this time. And as more and more people are ordering groceries online, and this starts to become a habit, the chances that months from now, are we going to go back to wanting to go to grocery stores, or are we going to stick in that habit of the grocery delivery? So I think also that the robot delivery services is not just a now thing. It is something, like Ryan touched on, that we do need to be thoughtful about, because once we go ahead and accept these into our society more and more and make these regulations, it is something that could stick around. So on that point, something that I'm really interested in is the privacy by design part. So like like Michael mentioned, Ryan's really keen on the AI, machine learning, bias part of that. I'm really interested in that digital physical combination. So what does it mean to have these robots in public spaces? We've seen with Neuro, when they received the exemptions to operate on the sidewalk, they got exemptions to remove the mirrors, but put on more cameras and sensors. And this was for safety. But there's also a privacy data trade-off there that I'm thinking we're not really examining that trade-off properly. So something that I'm going to be doing in my work is working with stakeholders, members at FPF, and coming up with some type of guidelines or privacy by design practices, because as we know, the US is not at the state of having a federal law yet, but is there some work that we can do with the industry to come up with guidelines about best practices in this area? The bingo slot.
Yeah. Now, I loved when you said privacy by design. I immediately wanted to go, where can I get guidelines for this? How can we incorporate this? Now, one of the other things that has been touched on already is the race to commercialize. And what worries me is that there are many, many people making robots who make very thoughtful robots, but that adds extra time to the process of designing the robots to do it right. And other people can shortcut things and produce robots that are very bad by design, and yet the incentives are not well balanced because they get to be the first one out of the gate, as it were. And, you know, I can think of a couple of examples that I won't name at the moment, but we have certainly seen some bad robots roll out first. And on the one hand, I hear that's okay because we're going to come in and fix all the problems that they've caused, and therefore people will find it desirable to use our robots, not those robots. But at the same time, if the law is being, if regulations are being written around certain physical designs, how do we stop that? How do we change that? I'm very naive as far as that goes, particularly in the American system. What can we do if very specific, poor legislation is being put in place?
I think that what's critically important are two things, and these are pretty high level. That is to say, they're really at the level of first principles. One of them is that just because someone is first out of the gate and attracts a certain amount of resources and has a prototype, doesn't mean that's the best way to do something, right? Even if that someone is a household name tech company. And the second is that hard problems require real trade-offs. And there's nothing about technology that's going to make that go away. So let me apply that to the example that Michael offered about contact tracing. This is, you know, the notion of being able to figure out who's encountered someone who's infected and notify them that they're an issue. So, you know, just because Apple and Google create an API that permits you to do contact tracing through Bluetooth and it's decentralized and whatever, doesn't mean it's going to work. And, you know, I did a deep dive on this with a technologist and an epidemiologist, and I just published something with Brookings this week about it. Testified before the Senate a couple of weeks ago about the same topic. There's a lot of concern in many quarters with a lot of different kinds of experts that this is not going to work at all. And yet, this is what Silicon Valley, or this is what these two companies have come up with as in response to the pressure to do something about COVID. Similarly, on the trade-offs issue, and this would be a great thing for Chelsey to address in particular. Yeah, if you want to do contact tracing right, it's a shoe leather thing. It's got to be like, you got to figure out who's sick, and you got to talk to those people, and you got to talk about where they've been and who they're friends with. You know, if you want to use an app for it, you have to get their location history, their health status. It is going to involve privacy and civil liberties trade-offs if you're going to do contact tracing in a way that's effective. So again, just at a first principles level, and you can apply it to drone delivery or contact tracing or anything, you can't get out of hard trade-offs just with technology. And just because somebody came up with something first doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's the right solution, which Andra, you just said. I mean, I'm parroting you on that point.
No, it's a good point. And I think it just comes across, I guess, a promise like that makes a great soundbite. And yet the accuracy of people's promises, we don't hold that to account in any way that I can see at the moment. Now there's really interesting discussions happening, and I think someone has shared the link to your Brookings Institute article, Inaccurate and Insecure, Why Contact Tracing Apps Could Be a Disaster. Is that the one? We'll make sure we get
that. Yeah, that's the article I wrote with Ashkan Soltani and with Carl Bergstrom. One's a technologist, one's an epidemiologist. I think I saw Michael's hand, but yeah.
Okay, and I believe that Missy Cummings shared a great link around design guidelines, I think, with Batya Friedman's work on value-sensitive design. So I'm certainly going to have a look at that. I also find in the chat, we have someone who's disagreeing with the need to slow down, put the brakes on, or hit pause, as it were, when this is a crisis situation, saying, you know, no, we should just go ahead. Robin, you've got your hand up. Please take this one.
Yeah, so I've been doing disaster robotics since 1995, and I've been in 30 disasters, not of my own making. And we see a lot of groups come in and do what I call this fear of missing out. And we're seeing this a lot in COVID. So it's one of the 4 syndromes that we see that don't lead to the best thing. And that's, well, everybody else is doing it, therefore we should be doing it. I mean, with no thought. I mean, we've got use of aerial drones, agricultural drones that are spraying chlorine-based solutions for disinfectant. We have no proof. I mean, the agriculture people, we're looking at each other going, what are the standards that you're using to have this for cleanliness? What's the environmental hazard? Oh, look, they're spraying by people. Chlorine's poisonous. Okay, maybe it's hydrogen peroxide. All of these things need, as Ryan's saying, needs to be thought out. So I think we need to look at that. So it's not just, oh, anything works. And then we forget about the liability of these agencies. So these hospitals, public health, public safety, they are accountable, both legally and their careers, you know? So we're giving them stuff that typically, if it's a low technology maturity level, it's going to be even less in this new instance that we've never tried it for. And so what I typically see is people take this with their, you know, and call it the limbo dance competition. How low can you go? I mean, how little, you know, I've got such a prototype. We just invented it last night. Well, how is that going to break? How is that not going to require more manpower? I mean, look at, oh, we had DARPA, you know, the robot competition with, you know, legged robots that were falling down and had 28 people for every robot. So these are things we can't really support inside a hospital, is add more problems for them to people who are already stressed out and overworked and dealing with the surge. So,
can I throw in one little thing? You said something, Andra, that really sparked, I think, a thought that's useful to throw in, although it makes things more complicated, not simple. You said, where do I go to find out about this? You know, speaking as a designer. And the trouble is right now, actually, there are so many different ethical standards being promulgated by so many different groups that if you're a maker of especially an AI product, and you want to find something that will allow you to do what you want, we call it ethics washing. You just go shopping for the particular ethical standards that you do what you want, and you're likely to find them. We don't have agreement yet on sort of core standards. We don't have enough of experience, all the different kinds of use cases even to figure out how to write them, except at a high level of generality where they don't become as useful as they should. So doing it right takes time. It really does. I mean, that was, I think, part of Robin's point. It's absolutely correct. Doing it right, and there isn't a single checklist we can point everybody to and say, well, you just do these 17 things and you're going to be fine. And that's a very hard place to be, but it's part of being early.
Now,
And just to
Can I-
add from the operational side, working within a business as a privacy lawyer, working with engineers and product, whether it's a set of principles or guides, or if you have a law, it is extremely difficult to operationalize privacy and data management within a company. And I think a lot of companies maybe think privacy data protection as a last resort. We've seen with video conferencing software that it was kind of not really top of mind until it started to come in the news and issues came up. A lot of companies aren't really putting in the resources and the people ahead of time to think about this. And it's really not that easy to do so, but it's definitely worth it.
Absolutely. And I believe that if companies are interested in making that their business to develop effectively a privacy middleware layer, then one of the things that we are seeing in robotics is the kind of the commercializing of some of the subcomponents of a robotic system, and navigation, for example, is really the key one at the moment. And at the moment, everybody pretty much designs their own navigation stack for robots. And large customers are looking at that saying, well, we're effectively buying 6 maps for one location as we work with different robotics providers. So there's going to be a commercial incentive to just have that one navigation package that is going to reduce the costs in the end run. And I think effectively one privacy package that was certified or validated in X number of use cases would reduce the liability so much that when we start to pay attention to this, you know, I can see that making good business sense. I can't see it being the thing that people rush to for their first deployments. However, one of the discussions that got brought up was that the way that we can move quickly and yet remain responsive to ethical and other concerns is through open sourcing the design. I think, Matt, that was your suggestion. And Michael, you're advisor at EFF. Do you think that open source is actually one of the tools that we can leverage in the design process? And Chelsey, this might be something that you're thinking about as well.
So I'm a big fan of open source, but I'm not sure it's a solution to everything. And transparency even isn't always a solution to everything. I mean, for example, in the AI area, what I've been thinking about it the most recently, you can, a lot of what's being called transparent AI is either limited or very, very difficult to actually do. Anupam Chandra has suggested something that might make more sense in a lot of use cases, which is to have someone outside the organization design test data, which would then be run through the system, and we'd see what it does. And that's how we tell if it was biased or not, by looking at the outputs based on some sort of inputs. Now, again, that's, it's not something you can just do off the shelf because each app is different. So you have to sort of, design those on a case-by-case basis. It's time-consuming, it's expensive. But it might mean more to us, actually, to understand that, these different cases were treated in ways we thought were appropriate if we're worried about bias. I'm not sure open source is going to tell you a lot about bias in a way that's visible to hardly anybody.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. Chelsey, please.
I would second, Michael, that it's not the silver bullet. And just to give a concrete example, MDS, Mobility Data Specification, which is the set of APIs to share mobility data between operators like rideshare companies. It's used for scooters and local governments. It's really popular in the US. It's also very controversial. That's an open source project. Cities can kind of use it as they'd like. And if anyone in the chat here in the video is not familiar with it, definitely check it out because it's a very interesting area. It also ties into this conversation as well because while the use case right now is about scooters, MDS is built to scale to all forms of mobility and more types of data than just location, battery life. It could also incorporate camera feeds. So when you start thinking about delivery robots on sidewalks, what would it mean if city governments want to try tapping into these data sources. So there's a lot of layers to this.
Thank you, Chelsey. I was just thinking it would be wonderful now if we've perhaps reawoken a desire to do future planning scenarios in these use cases, because I think we know that a lot of good in robotics came out of the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown, and it's the incentive behind the DARPA Robotics Challenge. We're seeing the SubT challenge as well, and certainly in New Zealand, the Pikes River mine disaster was, well, it's one of many mining disasters where we just don't have robots that are capable for this solution. We're running through a real life exercise right now, but we can continue to develop and adapt systems after. Well, I think this crisis is going to be around for quite a while, but we're at least starting to look ahead at what technologies we want to have coming out of this. But a really interesting discussion that was coming up before there, Sue was pointing out that 10% of the Australian population had downloaded a contact trace within the 2 days of it being announced. I believe somebody pointed out that, Ryan, I think you pointed out that that means 9 out of 10 people aren't using it, so it's not very safe. But it's definitely something that is strongly appealing to everybody. Oh, and Robin's pointing out that in Pikes River, the robots made things worse. Well, it's perhaps one of the most difficult scenarios I think that anybody could pick for any kind of robot response. I suspect that even deep pressure undersea, we've had more successful robot deployments than we have in that methane or other flammable gas-filled environment. But teleoperation and telemedicine, just coming back to that, Ken, do you want to talk a little bit about where you think robotics should be going? And indeed, perhaps teleoperation, having a human in the loop, could serve as a canary in the coal mine, to mix the metaphors, as a first point of alarm in, hold on, should I be looking inside of everybody's wardrobes or watching their children while I'm in this robot? Where are the protections and safeguards?
No, that's a great point. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because this is a great discussion. And one of the elephants in the room here is that we are all very suddenly opened up our lives and our homes to this new technology, Zoom, with very little careful analysis. As everyone knows, there's been lots of security issues and privacy issues around it. But I was thinking about the idea of robots that are connected to the cloud robotics, which makes a lot of sense for practical reasons, right? That you can store data sets and computation can be done remotely, but that opens up this huge Pandora's box that anyone can also come in and commandeer a robot in your house and essentially look around, explore what's going on. And we're doing that unwittingly, right? We've all done this as we carry the laptop around from room to room. We're basically showing the world like all these details about our homes. And I mean, Andra, you have all these interesting books on your bookshelf. Now, I can't quite see them, but I bet I could run some software to analyze your library, which is very informative about you. And if I'm trying to sell you something, it might be interesting to just note that you're missing one volume of some trilogy that we can sell you or something like that. The other I want to just throw out is related to an aspect of robotics is that someone has posted about the idea that auditory could be used as a very interesting tracking signal. That is to detect coughs and changes in voice, auditory signals that would be able to give you an early warning that someone might have symptoms of COVID. There's a kind of particular signature of a dry cough. So there's a paper on that. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But what if they would build an app that suddenly you could download that would basically monitor you, all day long and monitor coughs, and then basically give you some sort of warning. Now, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, I'm thinking, but auditory, I feel, is a huge area that Amazon, I mean, Echo and Google Home, we've opened up that channel, and we're doing it now because with Zoom, we all have these unmuted microphones, and they're essentially picking up not only what we intend, but a lot of unintentional auditory and visual signals that I think are a big cause of concern if we're not careful about it.
That is very interesting. I think audio is often a much more subtle issue than vision, because we're really such visually oriented creatures. I'm sure you'd recognize a lot of the books on this shelf. This is, my pocket robotics library. It's pretty large these days. But what you talked about the ability to manipulate me through being able to just sense a little bit more about me or my environment. This is something, Ryan, you've talked about the ability to digitally manipulate us. And this for me is one of the real ethical issues for robots that there are 5 ethical guidelines that have come out of the UK Engineering Council that I think are perhaps the best in steering ethics. And the one that is least popular, I think, and hardest to get is precisely that. It's around the ability of robots to manipulate us. Simply because it's surprisingly easy to manipulate people, and robots are most likely going to be deployed for commercial purposes. So, you've got a lot of people thinking about how to utilize those interactions, and it's not necessarily motivated for our best results. Ryan, do you want to talk about that a little?
Well, right. I mean, so I wrote some work years ago about one of the things that roughly speaking, artificial intelligence, which everybody on this call knows is not a thing. It's a set of techniques aimed at approximating some aspect of human or animal cognition using machines. But one of the things that certain techniques of artificial intelligence are good at is spotting patterns. And some of those patterns can be irrational consumer behavior that you can exploit. But if you want to see a great paper about how you could apply that insight to robotics, look at Woodrow Hartzog's Unfair and Deceptive Robots. That's such a great, it's such a great article. And it's about the way in which you could use our tendency to react to anthropomorphic machines as real social agents, that you could use that to really manipulate us. But what Ken is talking about, I think is incredibly important, which is that there is both the capacity and also, of course, the business incentive to leverage all the information that you might get your hands on in order to sell and market, including what's on your bookshelf. One thing I do want to point out, this is kind of funny to me, and if you'll excuse me looking at my phone, but there was a really, really funny tweet today that dramatizes the way in which all of this social distancing has the power to enhance this predisposition that we have to thinking about robots as people, right? And it reads, it's a little bit of offensive language, but it's from Abby Jimenez, and it reads, "Me before quarantine watching Castaway. Really? He's best friends with a ball? Me during quarantine. Look at you go, Roomba, you crazy son of a bitch." You know what I mean? Like this idea of like she's like anthropomorphizing this robot because there's no people around. There's just this thing in her environment. That's a real danger that in a moment when we are socially vulnerable, that robotics would be introduced in a way that was manipulative is acute. But anyway, I think Hartzog, Unfair and Deceptive Robots is the article to look at.
An excellent point. And I see the link is in the chat already, which is great. I'm thinking again that teleoperation or inserting humans in the loop is perhaps one way to really ameliorate this current issue. But if we were to look way down the track, some considerable length of time, at the moment, we don't recognize robots as an agent in the law, even though psychologically speaking, we can always be fooled into treating robots as agents. But yet we do recognize companies or corporations as agents. what is it going to take? I guess, you know, this question may be too far out there, but what is it going to take for us to start to develop a sense of robots as a legal agent?
I'll buy. It has to be useful for some human purpose, right? Assuming we don't get a robot revolution where they rise up and demand their rights. And I'm not holding my breath on that one. It has to be useful, right? We gave corporations personality because it was useful for the people who owned and ran corporations, although it may or may not be useful for the rest of us. But you know, I don't see the use case right now for a robot personality. On the contrary, it seems like a way to avoid making the people who build and deploy them both legally and morally responsible. So I think we need the opposite of it. You know, it's not a use case; it's an avoidance case. I have trouble understanding, other than it's cute, right? The idea of a robot owning itself is really cute. And Linda Puckey wrote a really cute article about how an AI might even be able to own itself under modern law. It's not useful. It's harmful.
Well, I guess I was thinking about it in terms of being able to verify that it was a device with certain characteristics. So we face an interesting situation with robots in that they can be changed, hacked, or updated or upgraded.
The manufacturer or the operator has to have certain characteristics, like a driver's license.
Yeah. Or
a certificate of safety from NHTSA or whoever, be the Ryan's robot regulator. I mean, I'm just not seeing again why anything that deracinates it morally and legally from the people makes my life better.
True, and I'm not suggesting actually that it should be at a level of people in such, but this is taking me way, way back. When I did my master's, I did my research on the naming of robots and what it said to, just analyzing the evidence that was available in the culture, because we've had robot competitions back since the 70s. And there was a lot of evidence that showed that robotics researchers actually named their robots. So they were anthropomorphizing back then. But I ran into an interesting fact where robots that were reused year after year and were in some cases completely different hardware and completely different software would still get the same name, but they would have variants added each time. And it was interesting to try to understand what was the thing that was the same if certain aspects of the robot had changed. And so I got involved in questioning that a little bit further, like what was it that made a robot the same in terms of people's understanding of it or expectation. That's taken me a little bit too far away, I think. Now, Roy, are you able to talk a little bit about the SRI International robots, and do you have a screen to share or some footage? It's a little bit late, but hopefully we can see a little bit more of robots in action.
Yeah, so first of all, great conversation, and I'm a poor substitute for Tom Lowe, our director. I'm literally in the closet at the moment, but hopefully get some of these ideas out of the closet. But the first thing that SRI is endeavoring to pursue does relate to the conversation that's been going on. And let me give a little background, and then I'll connect it to the conversation. So early on in the crisis, there was the great fear that we were going to run out of ventilators. And so there are lots of open source ventilator projects. And it seems like with flattening the curve and other reallocation of resources, ventilators are not the issue. But it turns out that it's not good enough just to have a ventilator. A ventilator needs an operator round the clock monitoring each patient. So we're going to run out of trained ventilator staffs before we run out of ventilators themselves. And so you might say, okay, well, we can just build a front end on a ventilator and people can remotely control it. Well, it turns out that the FDA is not a big fan of building in the ability, connectivity to the internet on life-critical medical devices. So how can robots address that? Well, it may be just a bit of a regulation workaround, but if you had a humanoid robot or a robot even with a single arm on a stick, then you could have it go into an ICU and under remote control, push the buttons and on a device and also provide lots of visual feedback on the device. So it's a way of, you are not altering the FDA approved device, and no hospital, even in a crisis, is going to take a chance on hooking up non-approved life-critical instruments. So you can use these existing approved instruments and still have them controlled remotely. So that was Tom Lowe's insight, which comes from the fact that he is married to a retired ICU nurse who pointed that out.
He also developed the Taurus as well. So his background is in surgical robotics. Yeah, I think that is an amazing insight. And I love the creative application of robots to problems that comes out of SRI International.
Yeah, and just writing lots of great coattails. I see people saying I'm a genius. I'm just relaying other people's ideas. But just to throw out one other project, which I don't know, we're running out of time. You want to keep this to an hour, would be Ruben Brewer's go-between robotics. I don't know, I'll leave it to you to decide whether it's worth showing that video, or I could I'll just put in the chat, go-between robotics, and describe it.
I was going to mention that. So please just describe it and put the link in chat. That would be wonderful.
So Ruben Brewer, interestingly enough, came to SRI well, via many different startups, like many people in the Valley, but he had a background in developing an robotically automated IV insertion. And perhaps taking that method of thinking, he developed a robotic system for having a police officer pull over a vehicle. Pulling over a vehicle is actually a very dangerous thing for a police officer. It's dangerous because they can get hit by traffic, and it's dangerous because the officer is hyper aware that there's a possible threat from a person in the vehicle, and the person in the vehicle may feel threatened, and it's just a recipe for disaster. And so he mounted on his own car a robot arm that sticks out and has a very friendly looking anthropomorphic robot head that goes to the window of your car and says, "Good evening, are you aware that you were speeding?" And so that's a way of, we didn't use the term when he developed it, but it's social distancing. And it's social distancing, it wasn't done for prevention of disease transmission, but it was done for the safety of the operator of the robot and for the safety of the person in the vehicle. So I just thought it, of course it could work for social distancing for first responders for disease prevention, but I just thought it was a very interesting that he was doing social distancing before it was a thing.
Yes, indeed. It is a great video. I hope people will see the link in the chat. And thank you very much for sharing that with us, Roy. And I think you were a great stand-in for Tom. I appreciate it, especially having to go into the closet for the call. Now, a few points were being made in the chat about how it would be much easier to modify the device, the actual ventilator. But the point was that you cannot physically modify the ventilator and have it remain FDA approved. Now, the question that I get when I think about a robot teleoperated, pushing the buttons on critical care devices is, how can we trust that robot? How can we know that that is the robot that is supposed to be doing this? And the fifth ethical guideline for robots, the one that I also think is greatly underrated and understated, is that robots need to have identification. They need to have some way of saying that robot is not that robot, when so often they all look alike. And we're entering into a situation where places, particularly hospitals, are going to have multiple robots from different service providers, multiple robots that may be being controlled by different people. And you could easily, you know, even with the best of intentions, end up in a situation where the robot that is on one floor doing tasks is, everyone is under the impression that it is a different robot that is supposed to be doing something different. So we need to really make it very, very clear. Like, vehicles have license plates, boats, planes, cars, and yet this is not something that I see on delivery robots or any other sort of mobile robot. And I think this is really one of the most fundamental issues that we should start solving. But I would like to just throw it back to our fantastic speakers to leave us with your parting thoughts. What do we need to really worry about? What is going well? Or what parting thoughts do you have for us? And Ryan, I'll call on you again to start.
Thank you. I mean, I'm not going to say anything new. I wanted to just echo something that Robin said over chat, which, and just to sort of pull it out, but it's Robin's comment, that it's incredibly important to do what Harrison is describing, which is to understand the context in which you're building an application, and to let the context and the need and the stakeholders in that context dictate what the robot is, and not vice versa. Don't just build something because you independently think it might help. You know, talk to stakeholders, get a sense of the context, and that is a necessarily interdisciplinary exercise.
Excellent, thank you, Ryan. And Robin, calling on you next. What parting thoughts would you like to leave us with?
Well, I'd just like to follow up on what Ryan said, and to take it one level lower, deeper, is NASA calls it designing for the individual robot design, and then you have to design for how it fits in the system, because there's no just, well, I guess there was deep space one, but the robot has to fit within this larger system, and they find a huge amount of failures with a robot that works, but not with everything else, not the way people work, not with the system, not with the protocols, not with all that. And again, it gets back to the point of working with the users and solving their problem, not our problem or our favorite technology, is really key.
Thank you, Robin. That's good thoughts there. In fact, my problem is remembering what I'm supposed to be saying, because I'm listening to all the things that are being raised now. And, but before I get carried away, Michael, what are your parting thoughts?
Well, I absolutely agree with both Ryan and Robin. I mean, I think you not only have to think about the use case, you have to think about the people, right? So you don't want to reduce the people to that famous moral crumple zone. But I'll go one further. You not only have to think about the use case, you have to think about the misuse case. I mean, that's what animates, for example, the campaign to stop killer robots. And, you know, people who just don't want armed robots under any circumstances. And I think, you know, there's the Holmesian, in law we talk about the Holmesian bad man, right? Somebody who'll try everything that they can get away with legally. And of course, with robots, you might have to throw in everything they might be able to get away with illegally. So you want to think about not just the intended uses, but the dangerous unintended uses as well.
The negative externalities. Thank you very much, Michael. Chelsey, can I call on you?
Yeah, definitely. So just to stick kind of with the same theme, I love what Robin said, building on that about the systems. My previous job, I worked in a company that focused on smart cities. So again, going back to that, my fascination of the digital physical worlds combining, when you're thinking about these, whether it's autonomous vehicles, delivery robots, scooters, these different form factors of mobility that we're going to increasingly see, these aren't just standalone objects in our environments. Our public spaces should be built for humans, and we're putting robots in our human spaces. So what does that mean from a design perspective? I think that involves thinking about that, the systems, the subsystems, everything is going to be connected a lot more than it used to be, especially when we have sensors, cameras built into infrastructure, the 5G vehicle to everything, communications. And so it can be really easy to get caught up in the technology. How do we make this use case work for safety? How can we make the robots deliver more packages on time, but always, as all the other speakers have said, how do we go back to the human use cases? Do humans actually want this? Would it really benefit humans? And what does that mean for our built environments? How are we changing our built environments for robots when we should be thinking about changing our built environments for humans?
Those are excellent points, Chelsey, and thank you for raising the smart cities, because just thinking about what you were showcasing earlier, Sue, with AnyWheel, it is making the wheel itself the robot. And, you know, surely that's the direction that we're going to be going in, where everything around us can be becoming a robot or connected as part of a system. So whether that's a smart table, a smart chair, or a smart house that can connect to those tables and chairs, whether our grocery shop is going to be able to remember every time we visit, and we're not going to be, say, thinking about contact tracing because of the devices that we have, but rather the system that's connecting all the places around us. So I think, you know, smart cities is a real extension of robotics technology. And Sue, do you have parting thoughts, given I was really springing off on the AnyWheel device that you showed us?
Yeah, I guess I have less concerns about some of the, you know, developments that people are rapidly making in robotic technologies, I suppose inspired in terms of how they can contribute to help in the current COVID-19 situation, and more concerned with what I'm seeing in terms of how people are using, or as Michael really pointed out, misusing some of the existing robust technology. So, you know, having drones chasing people and hurling insults at them in Italy, having surveillance robots roaming the streets in Tunisia, asking to see people's papers. These are things that make me feel very uncomfortable in terms of how robots will be accepted in the future, because I mean, I think we are living in this you know, wonderful golden age where in general most people have a very positive, I think the figure is something like 58%, at least in Australia, of people have a positive view of how robots will impact on society. And you know, I really hope that some of these interesting use cases that people are coming up with robots don't unintentionally set us back.
That's a very valid point. I hope that too. And Ken, can I call on you for some closing words?
I mean, I have to say, it's such a great discussion, and thanks for putting this together, Andra, and bringing this to such an esteemed panel together. I think that I've been just thinking recently, trying to see positive aspects to this, and I think that we've been moving increasingly toward this idea of more and more obsession with our screens over the last few years, and all these apps and robots, etc., have made us essentially more and more distant physically from each other. And somehow I think this whole episode, and I have no idea how long it will last, but I think in one positive may come out of it in the long run, that it will reaffirm our appreciation for human touch, for human contacts. That once we can get back into a room, we hopefully won't be spending that time on our screens, but we'll actually be really appreciating each other. And so I think that I just want to end on that positive note, in that I think there's so many concerns, very, very well founded, about privacy and security, but I do think there could be maybe a glimmer of positive that comes out of all this.
Thank you very much, Ken. I really appreciate, finishing things on a positive, because I'm carrying away a lot of the thoughts from this discussion, very disquieting thoughts as well. But it's better that we work on designing for including, as Chelsey was saying, privacy by design. And we have such a wonderful opportunity to be developing robots that people want and that people need. So, it just behooves us to create the platforms in which we can make sure that we're designing the best possible robots. And I think tonight's discussion was a wonderful example of having a platform to move the dialogue further. And I very much appreciate everybody for joining me tonight. And it was wonderful.